So, we just thought to somehow demonstrate activity of a dinosaur nature repairing something quasi-handmade from the 20th century. An old camera lens. In this case, the repair isn't really a repair exactly, except it's just old stiff grease. Bear in mind the camera decides what is in focus here. It needs to be kind of cleaned up and relubricated. People used to talk about lubricated for life. It's like, I guess it depends on how long the life is. Now they talk about useful life or end of life. Just so bizarre. Like, it's also so calculated, the notion of planned obsolescence, and no one seems to be upset about that. To me, planned obsolescence is a criminal activity. But not only is it not prosecuted, no one even recognizes that it's a problem. You know, if you buy a screwdriver, it's a significantly solid object, should last your whole life. A screwdriver should easily last 100 years. And you needn't buy another screwdriver. That same logic doesn't apply to everything. Some things are not really so durable. I'm going to have to show you some of these things that are involved with this that are rather small. That ball bearing there sits on top of that spring, creating a certain clicking noise when you reach each aperture setting. These set screws hold some of these rings in place. This little elongated shoulder screw holds one of the rings that you turn, connects to the aperture itself, moving the aperture in and out. For reference, I guess, you can see the size of my finger, showing the size of that ball bearing especially. I mean, in this modern era, there's nothing particularly unusual about nano. But you see that, and by nano I mean the small size of things that humans manipulate, gene splicing and so on. The thing is that I don't have any million-dollar technology. I just have a pair of tweezers. I guess the weakest link at this point is my eyesight. The main issue with this particular item is that the grease is just old and sticky, and some of the rings on the lens that are supposed to turn don't turn very well. can't remember if I was inside this lens in the late 80s when I got it, 1988 or so. If I actually went in here and relubricated it then. Of course, at that time it was already at least 30 years old. I would say this lens was made in the early 60s. So it's approaching 60 years old. So much about refurbishing equipment is essentially just cleaning. Like an oil change. Something like this has such an incredibly beautiful design. With regard to the graphics on this particular unit and this orange, this ring is hidden. The orange is only revealed in these tiny holes. Gives you a graphical representation. The depth of field you'll achieve for a given f-stop. It's just sort of brilliant, beautiful design. At the risk of boring you, I'll continue. I remember being at a used camera equipment sale, and there was a woman fancied herself a cinematographer, and she was there looking for some sort of zoom lens. And at some point I'm not sure why, but I had a small zoom lens that wasn't for sale, but it was just, for some reason I had it on me, and I showed it to her and I said, maybe this is a good choice for what you're trying to find. And she found it absurd that I was showing it to her when I told her it was not for sale. Like I was teasing her or something. I guess I was, but in any case, all I meant to point out was that that particular manufacturer had made this very cute little small zoom lens that sounded like it was appropriate for her application. But in a way, I was just teasing her. But that's not my point for the story, was that somehow it was clear, I'm not sure why, that I was cleaning something with a Q-tip. Or somehow the subject of Q-tips came up. And she responded with the film school mantra, "Oh my God, you should never use a Q-tip because it's not lintless, because you'll leave Q-tip hairs, you know, in the camera or in somewhere where it might end up in the gate. And you'd end up photographing the hair just like that. And I remember responding with a kind of a typical thought of mine, which is like, oh my God, you're so uptight. Beautiful, graphic, anodizing. It's very neat. In my humble opinion, used to say that I had patience for many things, but not painting. Somehow applying paint, I've always felt sort of dissatisfied by it. Never as evenly applied as at the factory, never as durable as you would hope when you do some sort of home painting job. But then I realized I guess say that, and then I'd say I have patience for many things, but not painting. In other words, somehow I have patience for doing something like this. Not sure how you distinguish what is worth doing. What isn't. So as I was describing, you got these holes there. You got this ring that rides under it. So somehow you learn how to do this, either by being an intern in a factory in the mid-20th century in Switzerland, or some other equivalent lens assembly place. Or you just do it. Take something apart. The insecure might want to call this skilled labor. I guess, aside from dealing with patients, I could have been a dentist. And I could have made $1,000 an hour. In a way, I guess knowledge is just about looking at something with an eye to remember what you're looking at. Maybe that's the hard part, remembering. Attention to detail, I guess. It's arrogant to think that I have that much attention to detail, though. I mean, you just kind of stumble along. Depends how you want to analyze your own behavior, I guess. To me, righteousness is born of insecurity. Then you have this sort of deliberate insecurity, like I'm going to take something apart with the dream of, in my sort of strange miserly way, acquiring something without paying retail for it. Like, I mean, you have a choice in life. You're either a financial success and thereby you afford the things you want to toy with by paying retail, and others have paid you retail for your, I wouldn't say work necessarily, because most people who have money don't seem to work, but endeavors, shall we call them. That's called the economy, I guess. Maybe as a born contrarian, that was my goal, to derail that system, to essentially to get that free lunch. And then you'd say, well, but it's not free. You spend so many hours toiling. Look at this ridiculous thing you're doing, cleaning tiny rings. And by the way, you're toying with something that's so obsolete and worthless, it's not, you can't compare it to something modern that a vice president of a company would want to toy with now. He would want a 2020 Polaris off-road vehicle, for example, which is like an $18,000 go-kart. Case in point with the Q-tip comment here. A small fuzzy. Can you see that fuzzy? Pretty small. You know, a hair in the gate of a camera looks like a tree on the big screen. That was the cinematographer's point. Now that I've been in here, I better use some compressed air. I didn't want my dandruff to be in there. So, as a matter of being perceptive in the quest for knowledge, one would notice that this front element, which is set into this aluminum rings with threads and other rings, retaining ring that holds the glass into the housing, but you'd say, well, where do you set this? I mean, in a way it's sort of obvious. You screw it down until it stops turning. But the little set screw makes an indentation in the front section where it was assembled by the factory. So one would look for a small discoloration of the black anodizing or the paint, and a little scar in the aluminum where the set screw had come down to meet it. So you'd sort of be looking for that kind of forensic evidence to ensure that you put the thing back where it was. You can see there's sort of a scar there. Well, I can see it anyway. Can you? So you might take the set screw out with a small light source, look through the hole before you tighten it down to see that the scar corresponds to where the hole is. In this case, you sort of finish threading this in and get it reasonably tight, and I'd be willing to bet the scar is underneath that little screw there. But I would say that, wouldn't I? Speaking of screwdrivers lasting a long time, you can see that the screw, especially on black, is rather small and hard to see. Many screws have ended up on the floor, and then you get to use that expression, I'm on my hands and knees for a screw again. Yeah, I can see there's a little aluminum scar in there. Sort of. But you can see the screw compared to the size of my finger is rather small. So, dropping it the screwdriver is magnetic. Dropping the screw is conceivably synonymous with losing it. Speaking of screwdrivers lasting a lifetime, this screwdriver needs some work. There's actually a term for that called dressing a screwdriver. Sort of mechanically refurbishing the tip of the screwdriver so that it no longer has rounded off damage or whatever. But when you're talking about a screwdriver the size of this screwdriver, you need a magnifying glass just to see its poor condition. It's like looking at a razor blade under a microscope. You can see that it's not nearly as handsome looking as you think it might. And razor blades are handsome to some. Alright, even though I didn't need to pull that element out of that lens to do what I was doing, presumably the front of it's assembled again. Now back to the aperture. Which I may not have explained was the problem in the first place. It was sticky and hard to turn, and That makes it somewhat impractical to use. So now we need some new grease. This is not new, but it's grease. So then you have to remember how to put it back together. Guess first we had this thing here. So this turns on there, so you would want to grease it up. But you might say, you just removed the grease. Why are you greasing it up again? In the old days, you might have thought, well, job security, that's why. That's why it's made like that, so that you have to bring it back to the mechanic periodically. Like J.P. Morgan, who decided that the best capital maneuvering was to get involved in an industry in which your customer arrives to buy something they immediately burn, so that they'll have to come back tomorrow and buy some more. I guess food being the primary example. That sort of thing. And what would be more natural than consumption of food? You need energy. To me, it's demented, of course, because if you want to talk about something being natural, you might want to talk about hunting and gathering, in which case the person who's interested in the spoils of their labor, and therefore sustenance, does the work of hunting and gathering and eating at the end, or pooping at the end. So, that's natural enough, despite what the animal might say, or the plant. Fair enough. But as soon as you introduce the third party with his filling station, things change for the worse, my humble opinion. There's always the, which way does it go? Question. You put the thing in backwards. There are certain clues, like where that hole is. This is fixed. So there's the hole in the aperture there. I don't know if you can see that. The aperture being a series of blades, which you saw earlier, or will see in the future, inside this brass housing, and there's a hole in it there. This thing, the aperture control ring, I guess you'd call it, has a hole in it, as does this coloration ring. And then here we have the shouldered screw, which I'm trying to lose. Don't have enough magnet. Here I've gone and used a screwdriver as a lubrication distribution tool, and therefore using it as a screwdriver. Its primary application. Well, let's try a different technique with the tweezers, shall we? I'm getting playful with you now. So, if I have aligned this correctly, it threads into the brass ring below. And we are now moving the aperture with that screw and the outer ring in a much more fluid way now that the 60-year-old grease has been replaced. Boy, there is something beautiful in the design of that aperture. Can you see that? I hope you can, because pretty neat. I'm not really that turned on by this. I mean, I like it well enough. Just give that a final snug. Okay, so now you have that beautiful little anodizing thing, and then you have this ring which does ride on top of it. Though you don't want to get too much grease in all those small little holes, you see, so I'll just put a little bit of schmutz here and there. Although I don't think they really did that in the factory. I don't think I'll be around in another 50 years to do this again. You know, I do believe we have forgotten the tiny ball bearing, the most exciting part. I was so excited to show you the aperture, I forgot. It's not so unusual. There's another Q-tip here for you. To forget things. I guess that's why people make lists. Somewhere in the factory in the old days there might have been a list. How to assemble a Switar from serial number, 28,000 something to and beyond. Here we have number 672308. Hard to imagine that the company made 672,308 lenses up until this point. Maybe they started at 100,000 to make it sound like they were doing booming business. I think that's called a business strategy. Okay, so this little spring goes somewhere. I don't know. I mean, people talk about electricity like that's a good example of things that people, laymen, I guess they're called, as if we aren't all laymen. Try not to lose these tiny things here. Find mysterious. You know, not everyone is an electrician. Not everyone has studied physics and electricity and so on. So people have trouble with their light switch, and they say things like, I'm afraid of electricity. You know, not just because Edison demonstrated he could electrocute elephants, but just because it's intangible. It's so they're, you know, people are intimidated. I'm not going to take apart my such and such because I might die, you know. But that kind of sentiment, like I don't understand how it works, so I've never taken such a thing apart. So I couldn't do that. But there's a certain amount of risk, and I don't know, I guess you take that risk if you're confident. So that spring there that pushes on the ball bearing, pretty small. You know what? I'm just gonna risk taking that out and gooping it up. You know, just for sport. And here's this ridiculously small ball bearing. It sits on top of there, like an ice cream cone or something. And then you somehow put this on here in a delicate way, such that you compress the ball bearing into the hole without losing it. And you can see, maybe, that I have failed. The ball bearing being out there at risk of being lost. So you somehow have to push it down prior to shoving the ring on there. Springs are kind of the bane of the mechanic. They have a tendency to launch across the room. And when they're this small, you'll probably never see it again. One could use a very thin shim, perhaps. Or you could pretend you know what you're doing with a jeweler's screwdriver. Now, how do you tell you haven't lost the ball bearing somewhere? Should you ask? Well, you listen for that sound, you see. The sound of the ball bearing engaging each of these little engraved slots. The challenge might be when you were first taking this apart to know that that ball bearing was there, or at least notice it before it flung across the room. All right. Okay, now we have the proper clicking and the aperture is turning, and so on. So then this guy here comes up on here and is fixed to the lens barrel. However, it does move on top of this ring here, so let's schmutz it up. Very technical term, schmutz it up. Probably put too much. There's such a thing as the correct amount of schmutz, believe it or not. I'm having trouble with this. And you thought I was done with the wiping. So, as I was saying about the indentations where set screws have been in the past, I should have looked to see where that registration line was relative to the rest of the body of the lens. That would make it easier. Or you can kind of tell, like, okay, when you go wide open on the aperture, very likely that the registration line was aligned with the last setting. 1.9. And then you'd reinstall these tiny screws, all of which I've managed to maintain thus far. First thing I think about when I look at a screw that small is, damn, cutting that on a lathe must have been kind of challenging. and the threads are small, then you have some difficulty avoiding a cross thread. Then you have this retaining ring stretching issue where if you tighten one of these screws down too much before gradually applying pressure on all 3 points, you distort the shape of the ring too much, sort of like a lug nut on a wheel, for example. All very technical. So then you see we have the clicking in place to each aperture setting. Okay, so I'm going to try to wrap this up since I wasted enough of your time. Oh, here's the focus ring. There's a little set screw there for the end stop. Infinity. It's for photographing infinity. Or something closer, like 5 feet away. Okay, so then we have this rear cluster, which has got plenty of hairs. Have another instance where you go tight and then there's a little set screw inside there. Keep it from turning. Then we have the rear lens mount, which has a little tab there. If you're smart about such things, you try to remember where the tab went. I didn't really mark it so much as fill it with grease so that you could see. There's a little indentation there from the set screw, approximately in the right location. There we go. I happen to know that I took this apart at infinity, so let's put it back at infinity. Look and see there where the set screw has been for many years. Looks like the most recent one, but you check it with a collimator anyway. Move this deal until it's about there. Push it in. And I won't crank it down just now because you would check that the lens assembly relative to the film plane is in alignment so that the lens is focused on the film plane, which, as you might imagine, is very critical adjustment. Otherwise, you may not take a picture that's in focus, which is, I don't know. I guess that's still a priority, even though exposure and camera stability do not seem to be an issue anymore in this modern era. Okay, so my quest to have these rings move fluidly again seems to be a marginal success.
guy. Who you talking to?
Everyone and no one. All right. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this program.